In Matthew 24, verses 37 through 39, Jesus takes a look at how the days of Noah would be a picture of how things would be at the end of time.
As it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the days of the coming of the Son of Man. He speaks of how they were carrying on their daily activities, marrying and giving in marriage, eating and drinking, and they weren't paying attention, and they didn't know that the flood was going to come, despite 120 years of preaching. So shall it be, he says, in the coming of the Son of Man.
History is repeating itself. I'm sure the Lord looks down from heaven now. Jesus said, as it was in the days of Noah, so will it be in the days of the Son of Man. And we're seeing that in the world today, with the violence in the land, the selfishness, the self-worship that's out there. And I think it just is breaking the heart of God.
Perhaps the single most important practical lesson to try and find the present-day application for is, what does it mean to get on the ark?
We are living in the judgment hour. We're living in a final twilight in the world's history where we're standing on the threshold of eternity. And people need to realize these are awesome times, more so than any other time in history, because the sun is really going down on the world's probation. And now is the time when people need to prepare to meet their God.
What happened before the flood is going to happen again right before the second coming of Christ.
Those who don't have a perspective, who aren't looking at the scriptural message, they'll go on just as they do with the circumstances of life, and they won't see the end coming.
I'm Jeff Rich, Director of Layman Ministries. What you're about to witness will be unlike anything that you've ever seen before. Not only are we going to investigate the flood story, but we'll trace the roots of evolution and show how it's influenced Western society. And most importantly, we'll take a look at how the story of Noah helps explain the pages of Bible prophecy. This is the story of Noah and the flood like you've never seen before. Today, many Christians are anticipating the future coming of Christ, and they're wondering what's in store for planet Earth. They'd do well if they went back and they read a story of Noah and the flood, because within that epic story of the Bible, there's more of the future revealed to us than many know. In fact, the evidences are all around us.
God is love. His nature, His law, is love. It ever has been, it ever will be. Every part of creation, from the tiniest insect that floats in the sunbeams to vast galaxies in the far reaches of space, all are an expression of His unsearchable love.
no doubt whatsoever that the world before the flood spoke about the love of God. Everything was absolutely beautiful.
His love was expressed in anything and everything that you wanted to look at.
From the smallest single cell life form to the most complex being in that of Adam that he had created, everything was perfect.
If we could be transported back to find out what was the world like before the flood, you really need to think almost about it was like a different planet.
They were surrounded by an abundance of food. There was an abundance of beauty in nature.
The mountains were not jagged and rough and forbidding and dangerous like we see today. They were majestic and tall and rolling and covered with fresh topsoil and every kind of flower that you can imagine. Many of the animals and plants are extinct today.
There was no extreme colds, no extreme hot, no extreme dryness, no extreme weather.
And we didn't have this horrific storms that we have now.
And the trees were covered with vines and the little tendrils were wrapped around all in perfect order, just laden with fruit.
It mentions in Genesis how the water came up, as a mist came up and watered the land.
The earth was watered by like an automatic sprinkler system. The mist came up from the earth, according to Genesis chapter 2.
Rain was unknown.
Gems and gold and silver were just abundant on the surface of the ground.
Here you have this paradise, if you will, that was in many respects this perfect biosphere that would allow humans and animals to flourish.
The life expectancy of the people, of course, being very long, according to the biblical record.
When God makes it, he says it's good, good, very good. And it was in the face of all that beauty that man sinned. He was really without excuse because God had provided everything he needed.
Everything was in harmony and everything was perfect.
It's obvious when we look around us that we do not live in a perfect world. In fact, this planet is really not even very friendly towards human habitation when you consider that over 70% of the earth is covered with water. Add to that the fact that there are cold, barren waste places, vast deserts, mountain chains. Well, either this planet's always been like this, or something happened that fundamentally changed the surface of the whole earth.
What happened at the flood totally changed the geography of the world.
These little tiny bits of nature that are broken, that reveal to us the true horror of sin. And what we're seeing in our world is the consequence of that.
Man began to try to find happiness through selfishness and through sinfulness and wickedness. But God is so loving. He said, there's still people down there I can save. I want to save as many as I can. I'm going to give them a warning. If they have any threads of redeemable qualities left and they reach out, I'll save them. And so he created this ark. He created a vehicle through which they might be saved, and Noah a messenger through which they might learn.
God is warning us. God gives us prophetic insights for us to turn from them. It'll be disastrous, just as it was for those in Noah's day.
The story of Noah and the flood are in many ways a literal demonstration of Revelation's prophecies. So come with us now as we open the prophecies of Revelation by going back to the days of Noah.
In the days of Noah, there were evident tokens of decay, but the earth was still rich and beautiful in the gifts of God's providence. The hills were crowned with majestic trees, supporting the fruit-laden branches of the vine. The vast garden-like plains were clothed with verdure and sweet with the fragrance of 1,000 flowers. The fruits of the earth were in great variety and almost without limit. The trees far surpassed in size, beauty, and perfect proportion any now to be found. Their wood was of fine grain and hard substance, closely resembling stone, and hardly less enduring. Gold, silver, and precious stones existed in abundance. The human race yet retained much of its early vigor, but a few generations had passed since Adam had access to the tree which was to prolong life, and man's existence was still measured by centuries. Had that long-lived people, with their rare powers to plan and execute, devoted themselves to the service of God, they would have made their Creator's name a praise in the earth and would have answered the purpose for which He gave them life. But they failed to do this. There were many giants, men of great stature and strength, renowned for wisdom, skillful in devising the most cunning and wonderful works, but their guilt to giving loose rein to iniquity was in proportion to their skill and mental ability. God bestowed upon these antediluvians many and rich gifts, but they used His bounties to glorify themselves and turned them into a curse by fixing their affections upon the gifts instead of the giver. They employed the gold and silver, the precious stones, and the choice wood in the construction of habitations for themselves, and endeavored to excel one another in beautifying their dwellings with the most skillful workmanship. They sought only to gratify the desires of their own proud hearts and reveled in scenes of pleasure and wickedness. Not desiring to retain God in their knowledge, they soon came to deny His existence. They adored nature in the place of the God of nature. They glorified human genius, worshiped the works of their own hands, and taught their children to bow down to graven images. And under the shadow of the goodly trees, they set up the altars of their idols. Extensive groves that retained their foliage throughout the year were dedicated to the worship of false gods. With these groves were connected beautiful gardens, their long, winding avenues overhung with fruit-bearing trees of all descriptions, adorned with statuary, and furnished with all that could delight the senses or minister to the voluptuous desires of the people, and thus allure them to participate in the idolatrous worship. The worshippers of false gods clothed their deities with human attributes and passions, and thus their standard of character was degraded to the likeness of sinful humanity. God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. God had given men His commandments as a rule of life, but His law was transgressed, and every conceivable sin was the result. The wickedness of men was open and daring. Justice was trampled in the dust, and the cries of the oppressed reached unto heaven. The world was in its infancy, yet iniquity had become so deep and widespread that God could no longer bear with it, and He said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth. He declared that His Spirit should not always strive with the guilty race. If they did not cease to pollute with their sins the world and its rich treasures, He would blot them from His creation and would destroy the things with which He had delighted to bless them. He would sweep away the beasts of the field and the vegetation which furnished such an abundant supply of food, and would transform their fair earth into one vast scene of desolation and ruin. A 120 years before the flood, the Lord by a holy angel declared to Noah His purpose and directed him to build an ark. While building the ark, he was to preach that God would bring a flood of water upon the earth to destroy the wicked. Those who would believe the message and would prepare for that event by repentance and reformation should find pardon and be saved. God gave Noah the exact dimensions of the ark and explicit directions in regard to its construction in every particular. Human wisdom could not have devised a structure of so great strength and durability. God was the designer, and Noah the master builder. It was 3 stories high with but one door, which was in the side. The light was admitted at the top, and the different apartments were so arranged that all were lighted. The material employed in the construction of the ark was the cypress or gopher wood, which would be untouched by decay for hundreds of years. The building of this immense structure was a slow and laborious process. Yet the ark itself could not have withstood the storm which was about to come upon the earth. God alone could preserve his servants upon the tempestuous waters. By faith, Noah, being warned of God of things not seen as yet, moved with fear, prepared an ark to the saving of his house, by the which he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness which is by faith. While Noah was giving his warning message to the world, his works testified of his sincerity. It was thus that his faith was perfected and made evident. He gave the world an example of believing just what God says. All that he possessed, he invested in the ark. As he constructed that immense boat on dry ground, multitudes came from every direction to see the strange sight and to hear the earnest, fervent words of the singular preacher. Every blow struck upon the ark was a witness to the people. Yet they did not turn to God with true repentance. They were unwilling to renounce their sins. During the time that elapsed before the coming of the flood, their faith was tested, and they failed to endure the trial. Overcome by the prevailing unbelief, they finally joined their former associates in rejecting the solemn message. Some were deeply convicted and would have heeded the words of warning, but there were so many to jest and ridicule that they partook of the same spirit. The men of that generation were not all, in the fullest acceptance of the term, idolaters. Many professed to be worshipers of God. They claimed that their idols were representations of the deity, and that through them, the people could obtain a clearer conception of the divine being. As they endeavored to represent God by material objects, their minds were blinded to his majesty and power. They ceased to realize the holiness of his character or the sacred, unchanging nature of his requirements. As sin became general, it appeared less and less sinful, and they finally declared that the divine law was no longer in force, that it was contrary to the character of God to punish transgression, and they denied that his judgments were to be visited upon the earth. Had the men of that generation obeyed the divine law, they would have recognized the voice of God in the warning of his servant. But their minds had become so blinded by rejection of light that they really believed Noah's message to be a delusion. It was not multitudes or majorities that were on the side of right. The world was arrayed against God's justice and his laws, and Noah was regarded as a fanatic. The world made merry at the folly of the deluded old man. Instead of humbling the heart before God, they continued their disobedience and wickedness, the same as though God had not spoken to them through his servant. But Noah stood like a rock amid the tempest. Surrounded by popular contempt and ridicule, he distinguished himself by his holy integrity and unwavering faithfulness. A power attended his words. Connection with God made him strong in the strength of infinite power, while for 120 years his solemn voice fell upon the ears of that generation in regard to events which, so far as human wisdom could judge, were impossible. The world before the flood reasoned that for centuries the laws of nature had been fixed. The recurring seasons had come in their order. Heretofore, rain had never fallen. The earth had been watered by a mist or dew. But by their obstinate resistance to the reproofs of conscience, that generation filled up the measure of their iniquity and became ripe for destruction. The period of their probation was about to expire. Noah had faithfully followed the instructions which he had received from God. The ark was finished in every part as the Lord had directed, and was stored with food for man and beast. And now the servant of God made his last solemn appeal to the people. With an agony of desire that words cannot express, he entreated them to seek a refuge while it might be found. Beasts of every description, the fiercest as well as the most gentle, were seen coming from mountain and forest and quietly making their way toward the ark. A noise as of a rushing wind was heard, and lo, Birds were flocking from all directions, their numbers darkening the heavens, and in perfect order they passed to the ark. Animals obeyed the command of God, while men were disobedient. Guided by holy angels, they went in 2 and 2 unto Noah into the ark, and the clean beasts by 7s. The world looked on in wonder, some in fear. Philosophers were called on to account for the singular occurrence, but in vain. It was a mystery which they could not fathom. God commanded Noah, "Come thou and all thy house into the ark, for thee have I seen righteous before me in this generation." Noah's warnings had been rejected by the world, but his influence and example resulted in blessings to his family. As a reward for his faithfulness and integrity, God saved all the members of his family with him. Mercy had ceased its pleadings for the guilty race. The beasts of the field and the birds of the air had entered the place of refuge. Noah and his household were within the ark, and the Lord shut him in. A flash of dazzling light is seen, and a cloud of glory more vivid than the lightning descends from heaven and hovers before the entrance of the ark. The massive door, which it was impossible for those within to close, was slowly swung to its place by unseen hands. Noah was shut in, and the rejectors of God's mercy were shut out. The seal of heaven was on that door. God had shut it, and God alone could open it. For 7 days after Noah and his family entered the ark, there appeared no sign of the coming storm. But upon the 8th day, dark clouds overspread the heavens. There followed the muttering of thunder and the flash of lightning. Soon, large drops of rain began to fall. The world had never witnessed anything like this, and the hearts of men were struck with fear. All were secretly inquiring, can it be that Noah was in the right and that the world is doomed to destruction? Darker and darker grew the heavens, and faster came the falling rain. The beasts were roaming about in wildest terror, and their discordant cries seemed to moan out their destiny and the fate of man. Then the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. Water appeared to come from the clouds in mighty cataracts. Rivers broke away from their boundaries and overflowed the valleys. Jets of water burst from the earth with indescribable force, throwing massive rocks hundreds of feet into the air, and these, in falling, buried themselves deep in the ground. The altars on which human sacrifices had been offered were torn down, and the worshippers were made to tremble at the power of the living God, and to know that it was their corruption and idolatry which had called down their destruction. As the violence of the storm increased, trees, buildings, rocks, and earth were hurled in every direction. The terror of man and beast was beyond description. Above the roar of the tempest was heard the wailing of a people that had despised the authority of God. Others were frantic with fear, stretching their hands toward the ark and pleading for admittance. But their entreaties were in vain. Conscience was at last aroused to know that there is a God who ruleth in the heavens. Some, in their desperation, endeavored to break into the ark, but the firm-made structure withstood their efforts. Some clung to the ark until they were borne away by the surging waters, or their hold was broken by collision with rocks and trees. The massive ark trembled in every fiber as it was beaten by the merciless winds and flung from billow to billow. The cries of the beasts within expressed their fear and pain. But amid the warring elements, it continued to ride safely. Some of the people bound their children and themselves upon powerful animals, knowing that these were tenacious of life and would climb to the highest points to escape the rising waters. Some fastened themselves to lofty trees on the summit of hills or mountains. One spot after another that promised safety was abandoned. the waters rose higher and higher, the people fled for refuge to the loftiest mountains. Often, man and beast would struggle together for a foothold until both were swept away. From the highest peaks, men looked abroad upon a shoreless ocean. The solemn warnings of God's servant no longer seemed a subject for ridicule and scorning. How those doomed sinners longed for the opportunities which they had slighted. How they pleaded for 1 hour's probation, one more privilege of mercy, one call from the lips of Noah. But the sweet voice of mercy was no more to be heard by them. Love, no less than justice, demanded that God's judgments should put a check on sin. The avenging waters swept over the last retreat, and the despisers of God perished in the black depths. By the word of God, the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished, but the heavens and earth which are now, by the same word are kept in store, reserved unto fire against the day of judgment and perdition of ungodly men. Another storm is coming, and sin and sinners will be destroyed.
God is love, yet there's a limit as to how long he will endure evil. So we see that God sent a flood of water to wash away the evil of that age. But one question remains: could a worldwide catastrophe occur and not leave behind some evidence that it actually happened? The global flood is more than just a story written in a book. It's written in the earth itself. And these physical evidences remain as a witness and a warning to us. So now let's take some time to investigate the judgment. One of the most unique and beautiful features of the Grand Canyon are the various different colored sedimentary layers that run along the canyon walls for miles. These layers are made up of sandstone and limestone, and that's what creates that rainbow in the rocks. It's one of the things that makes the Grand Canyon so awesome to look at. But not only are these layers unique to the Grand Canyon, they give us our greatest clue on how the canyon was formed.
The rock layers that we see everywhere on the earth are generally in layers. The sedimentary rocks are almost all deposited by water.
We see the rock layers consist of turbidites, washed in material, and with the catastrophism that was going on, you would have turbiditic action and the washing in of material.
So water brings mud or sand or even coarser materials, carries it and deposits it in a layer. That's typically how the rocks in the geologic column form. And then there are different kinds of sediments, so they end up making rocks that look very different, right on top of each other. But there's the question of this one layer formed, and then how much time passed until the next layer came on top of it.
The commonly held belief is that over millions of years, an ocean advanced over the entire continent and deposited a sedimentary layer, and then retreated, leaving the ground dry once again. In this dry period, lasting tens of millions of years, this sediment would have been exposed to weathering and erosion.
And if it just sits there without being covered up fairly quickly, then a lot of things happen. Plants grow on it, roots go down through it, animals burrow through it. Flowing water will carve channels and gullies through it. And so it doesn't just stay undisturbed.
Tens of millions of years of weathering and erosion would create an enormous amount of uneven terrain between these two layers, such as hills and valleys, but this is not what we see. There's little variation between these layers. They're extremely flat.
And these time spans that supposedly occurred between two layers can be 10 million years, it can be 15 million, it can be up to 150 million years, like you see at one place in the Grand Canyon, in deposits in the Grand Canyon.
You'd expect a lot of erosion then. In fact, so much erosion that the whole record should be gone a long time ago. Average rates of erosion are about 61 millimeters per 1,000 years.
With the same rate of erosion of 61 millimeters per 1,000 years, we should not be looking for 300 feet of erosion, not 3,000 feet of erosion, but 30,020 feet of erosion over a period of 150 million years. All the sedimentary layers in the Grand Canyon combined should have eroded 6 times over, and yet these layers are flat, telling us that these layers were deposited rapidly in quick succession.
So is it realistic to think that 150 million years passed and nothing happened to this layer? It was not eroded out into serious gullies, and it looks much more likely that there wasn't that time in between those different layers.
The weather is always changing, and the surface of the earth is always changing with it. Thunderstorms, floods, hurricanes, earthquakes, and wind, among other factors, are always changing and sculpturing the surface of our planet. These elements are always depositing sediment or eroding sediment, resulting in irregular surfaces. If you have time, then you're going to have change. So when we look at the contact points between these layers of sediment and see no evidence of erosion and no evidence of deposition, this idea that millions of years went by and nothing happened to the surface, it just doesn't add up.
These are turbidite layers, often graded coarse to fine, which defies uniformitarian principles. It had to be rapid deposition.
When you have a gap of 100 million years, you have a couple miles of erosion. You had to look at the gap and it's flat. If it had taken a lot of time, you should have irregular erosion at the gaps.
So the erosional feature is saying, oh, hey, short time, not long time.
The flatness of the layers and so on tells you about a past that's entirely different. And this is the kind of data that you'd expect from the Genesis flood.
Millions of years worth of erosion is missing because it was never there. This is what the rocks are telling us. But erosion is not the only thing missing. In fact, entire layers of sediment representing tens of millions of years are also missing. Here in the Grand Canyon, you can see right behind me this light-colored rock. That's coconino sandstone. It's sandwiched right on top of this darker color here. It's called hermit shale. There's a layer of sediment missing between the coconino sandstone and the hermit shale called the Schnebly Hill Formation. Here we can see the lighter-colored coconino sandstone, and sitting beneath that is the Schnebly Hill Formation that was missing from the Grand Canyon. Beneath the Schnebly Hill Formation is the Hermit Shale, though somewhat obscured by the vegetation in the valley. This is the Schnebly Hill Formation. It's more than 800 feet of rock, which is said to represent about 6 million years.
And the problem that science has is that it cannot just remove that rock layer, because in the mind of the modern geologist, each rock layer is associated with time. So removing a rock layer means you've removed a block of time. So the solution to them would be, well, the bottom layers formed, the missing ones must have been there because the time was there, but here in this area there must have been a period of erosion that took them away to the previous layer, thus not leaving a trace, and then the next one was deposited on top. The problem with that is that the contact is absolutely flat, like one glass sheet on top of another one, leaving no evidence of those erosional features which would show deep leaching, washout, any one of those scenarios. They're not there.
Why are they a challenge to the long geologic ages? Because there is no erosion there.
The Schnebly Hill Formation is missing from between these two layers, and there's no evidence of any erosion. This tells us that there was little or no time between the formation of these layers, and that they were deposited rapidly in a catastrophic event. This is why the Schnebly Hill Formation is missing in between these layers in the Grand Canyon, and is seen yet in another location only 90 miles away.
So the Grand Canyon is a beautiful geological example of catastrophism and defies modern theories as to how these unconformities came about.
Here is the red wall limestone sitting on top of the mauve limestone. Between these two layers, we should see the Temple Butte Formation representing up to 155 million years of time. Instead, it's completely missing. There's no evidence of the 5.8 miles of erosion we would expect to see over this period of time.
There's no evidence of erosion, no evidence of deposition, just a flat contact. But you can't have an area of 30 or 40, 50,000 square kilometers that have a flat surface that sits there for 100 million years. 100 million years, after all, is enough time to erode North America down from its current elevation to base level, to sea level, 6-7 times.
And here the contact between the red wall limestone and the mauve limestone is flat, telling us that there was little or no passage of time between their formation. The 150 million years missing from between these two layers does not conform to the geological column, and for this reason, a sign has been placed here by the Park Service, marking it as yet another unconformity. We've looked at just a few of these unconformities, and in each instance there was no erosion or deposition taking place in the supposed periods of millions of years. These are serious problems for evolutionists, but they pale in comparison to what is called the Great Unconformity, a gap of over 1 billion years of missing time. And guess what? The contact between these two layers is flat, just like the others.
It is interesting as we go down to the level of the Colorado River, we find what we call the Precambrian. The volcanic material sits there, and it's pretty rough and pretty jumbled. And then the Cambrian sediments that come in over that lay over that, and then now they become very non-jumbled layer after layer.
I became keenly aware of that great unconformity that lies between the Precambrian and the Cambrian there in the Grand Canyon. You can't miss it. It's with you all the time.
The Great Unconformity in the Grand Canyon represents 1.2 billion years of time that is missing between the Precambrian and the Cambrian layers. Over this amount of time, we should see up to 45 miles of uneven erosion. That's nearly enough erosion to erode away the entire 25 miles of the Earth's crust twice. Yet the Cambrian sits flat on top of the Precambrian layer. And once again, the contact point between these two layers is horizontal, telling us that the deposition of these layers is not the work of 1.2 billion years of erosion, but empirical evidence for a widespread water-based catastrophe that occurred rapidly in a short period of time.
Then you come to the Cambrian layer, and all of a sudden things change dramatically. Most of your animal phyla appear all of a sudden in that Cambrian layer.
Not only isolated species, but whole phyla appear suddenly. Now that's mind-boggling. If you take a phylum, I mean, that's a huge category of creatures. A phylum Mollusca, for example, is every single snail and slug down to squids and octopi and all the creatures that belong to this group. And they all appeared simultaneously at the same time, that doesn't leave much room for slow evolutionary processes.
This is a double problem for evolution here that we have, and evolutionists are aware of this, and they call this the Cambrian explosion.
The Cambrian explosion is the period referred to in the Cambrian layers where animals appear fully formed in the fossil record. These fully formed fossils consist of the data we observe. Since the Precambrian layer does not contain fossils of animal phyla or intermediary species, this leaves the concept of origins from interconnected evolutionary steps ever to exist in the realm of theory.
So what does that talk about? Is that about evolution? Hardly. It's about creation.
This Precambrian layer, often called the basement rock, only contains fossils of single-celled organisms and some soft-bodied creatures such as worms or jellyfish. This fits the biblical record because before the flood, there was no severe weather patterns or large catastrophes to bury and fossilize larger animals. The Cambrian layer, however, right above it, is the first sedimentary layer deposited by the flood. And this is why in it we see whole phyla of animals appearing suddenly and fully formed. There are no traces of intermediary species or slow evolutionary processes because no such things ever occurred. These sedimentary layers in the Grand Canyon are not evidence for evolution. They are unbiased testimonies of a catastrophic flood. And when we look at the size of these deposits, they tell us that this catastrophic flood was a global event.
The Grand Canyon is there, and you can see the layers on the side of it, but all those layers go hundreds of miles up through Arizona and Utah and Wyoming and Montana and even into Canada, the same layers.
The Tepete sandstone at the bottom of the Grand Canyon was the first layer deposited by the flood. It spans all the way from Mexico up across North America and even into Greenland. The Morrison Formation covers 400,000 square miles from New Mexico to Canada, and the St. Peter sandstone covered approximately 500,000 square miles.
When I thought about looking at those layers the way they are, they're all flat. There are no cuts between them. Not only are the layers themselves laid down rapidly, but there's not millions of years between them for erosion.
The lack of erosion between the sedimentary layers in the Grand Canyon shows they were deposited rapidly in a catastrophe. But the fact that these layers extend for hundreds of miles, spanning several states and even up into Canada, shows the scale of the catastrophe was much larger than anything the world has witnessed in modern times.
In terms of worldwide flood evidence, we look at the sediments and looking at the structure of the sediments, the fossils that are found in the sediments and whatnot, we have what we call the geologic column. And we find the Cambrian, the Ordovician, the Silurian, the Devonian, the Carboniferous, and the Permian. Those are just some of the major structures that we see. We can find those in the United States. We can go over to Europe, and guess what? We find the same sequences. We go to Asia, we find the same sequences. We go to Australia, we find the same sequences. Not only do we find the same sequences in structure and content, but also the fossil content. To me, this says something had to happen worldwide, if not simultaneously, awfully close to simultaneously, for all of this to happen and all of the sedimentary structures to come down.
I try to focus on those things in the record that make us aware of the global aspect of the flood. For example, what we call the Cretaceous chalks that are found all over the world.
When a chalk layer is deposited in water, and it's calcium carbonate skeletons of foraminifera, marine organisms, and you have masses of these creatures. And you have this layer, and it spreads continent-wide to continent to continent. And it can only be deposited underwater. And therefore, the whole world must have been underwater at the same time. This is such compelling evidence for a universal flood that you have to really, really stretch the imagination to make it a periodic incursion or regression.
And those are just one of the kinds of deposits that tell us you had things happening on a worldwide scale, because you have chalk in a number of parts of the world, all at the very same place in the geologic record.
We will find that they sit on a iron-containing sand that we call glauconitic sandstone. And we'll find the glauconitic sandstone in England. We can find the same structures here in the United States, in Alabama, and that area. We can find them in Australia. And guess what? They're all sitting on glauconitic sandstones. They all have the same types of fossils. The whole business, it's there, but it's evidence that there was continuity across the world.
I'm here at the south rim of the Grand Canyon at an elevation of 7,200 feet above sea level. I'm currently standing on what is called the Kaibab Limestone Formation. This sedimentary rock is found all over Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and even as far away as the state of California. And it's teeming with marine fossils. The fact that you find fossils here tell us that this layer had to be laid down rapidly in order for fossilization to occur.
There are certain kinds of limestone formation, characteristic limestone formations you find in the Grand Canyon and other areas in the Paleozoic. And you find those in Europe and in Asia and other parts of the world. You find these limestones very typical, being global in their distribution. As you go up the record, there are things that are characteristic here that are around the world. You go up a little higher, you have different things that are characteristic around the world. You go up a little higher and you have other features of the rocks that are characteristic around the world. And we could go on. And there are many examples of this. And so why are those things so global? I think it's best explained by a global catastrophe.
The widespread distribution of chalk and other sedimentary layers is consistent with what we would expect to see in a worldwide catastrophe. But the fossils themselves, which is often thought to be evidence for evolution, are in reality further evidence for the Genesis flood story.
Finding the same fossils in the same layers worldwide, to me, is another strong salient point that there was a global flood, a global phenomenon. And when we look at the fossil record, we will find smaller, less complex fossils at the bottom. And as we traverse up the geologic column, we will find larger and larger complexity.
And this has led many people to believe that there is an evolutionary progression from simple to complex in the fossil record. Actually, there's no such thing. There's no such thing as a simple animal. Every animal, every creature ever found is highly complex.
And a lot of people talk about those as the first appearances of life.
I would like to propose that we're looking not as a record of life, but as a record of death.
It's the first appearance of the preservation of things that are dying.
We have this complex aqueous destruction, the flood, occurring. And as these sediments are settling, they are also settling and trapping the life forms as they die. Simple to more complex to more complex.
Obviously, if you're going to cover an environment with a turbidite, that which lives at the bottom will be buried at the bottom. That which swims at a higher level will be buried at a higher level. That which is on the top will be found on the top. And this is exactly what we find. We find fish that are fossilized in their position of swim, sometimes with food in their mouth. That's instantaneous.
Fossils are only created when they're rapidly buried. In order to have rapid burial, you need to have a catastrophe. A mudslide from heavy rain or a flood can cause such a condition. The fact that there's so many fossils found all over the world and in the same layers is evidence of rapid burial on a global scale. Another strong giveaway that this was the result of a global flood is the fact that many of these animals have been washed together by strong currents into what is called fossil graveyards.